Thank you, everyone, for joining today. Perhaps I can start by acknowledging that we are now over 100 days into this brutal and senseless war, and the consequences for the people of Ukraine have been momentous, and this has created the fastest growing refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. And I think all of us have felt very overwhelmed by that at a time when already we were reeling from the aftermath of COVID, which was such an unexpected event, global event, and an event that had impact in all of our lives. So I just want to acknowledge that I think we are living in very extraordinary and difficult times. And I want to thank you, because I know that sometimes seeing and hearing the news and thinking about the magnitude of what is happening can be very overwhelming. So I really appreciate that you are joining today for the discussion. And I really, we're quite a kind of small group, and with all of you being connected to Brown, I would really like this to be interactive, and I hope that you will feel free to ask questions. I don't know if that's possible through the chat function, or you can just unmute yourself when we get to that time, because I would really welcome some interaction from you. I thought I would start.
Let me just
interrupt. Go ahead, Judy.
Explain. Yeah, we have the chat disabled, and we're going to handle the Q&A through the raise hand function, which is found under reactions. So when the time comes, people will raise their hand and I will acknowledge them, and we'll alternate with the people who are live in our Corona Del Mar location. Okay. So that's how we're going to handle that.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for clarifying that. I thought I would start by just saying a very quick word about UNHCR. We are the UN Refugee Agency, and we were established after the end of the Second World War to deal with the refugee crisis in Europe. And in fact, it was meant to be a temporary agency. But of course, the world continued to struggle with displacement in the decades that followed World War II. And I'm very sad to say that a couple of weeks ago, we passed the grim milestone of 100 million people who are now displaced around the world. And this is something that, before we get into talking about Ukraine, I just wanted to acknowledge that we are, I think, at a time where the trend of displacement and the factors behind displacement are accelerating. And just a few years ago, the numbers were about 65 million displaced. And so just very suddenly, in the last 4 or 5 years, we've had a massive acceleration and passed 100 million. And Ukraine obviously has contributed a massive amount to that jump, because there are now about 5 million Ukrainians who have crossed the border into European countries as a result of the war. And in addition, there are 8 million people in Ukraine who are displaced within the country. We also know there are millions of others who are living under the threat of violence and who are in need of humanitarian assistance. So the situation is really very, very difficult. And while UNHCR had been scenario planning for the war, and we had pre-positioned a number of supplies across the country, and we had networks of people and plans in place, the scale and the speed with which this refugee crisis evolved exceeded our most pessimistic forecasts, and I think took the entire world by surprise. Just to speak a little bit about how we responded in this kind of crisis, there's an immediate focus on humanitarian assistance, and that means obviously we're working with other agencies also to deliver food, to deliver basic supplies to all the refugees and displaced people who need them. A lot of what we do falls under the banner of protection. And you've probably heard this word before, the protection of refugees. And what exactly does that mean? Many refugees flee their homes with no documentation or inadequate documentation. And many people in this conflict in particular, 90% of people who are crossing the border are women and children. And also many elderly people. As I'm sure you know, men between 18 and 60 are required to stay behind in Ukraine to assist the war effort. And this means, of course, that women and children have specific vulnerabilities. And many of the people, particularly now, who are crossing the border 100 days in, are traumatized. They are maybe unwell. They have suffered a great deal over the last 3 months. So while the initial wave of refugees who crossed the border tended to be people who maybe had left the country before, might have had their documents with them, might have had some experience of crossing into another country and had some resources to do that quickly, to leave the country quickly. The refugees who are, excuse me, arriving now tend to be more vulnerable and in greater need of additional services and additional help to get back on their feet. As you know, the country that has accepted by far the most number of refugees is Poland. And other neighboring countries have also, there's been a very significant influx, but in Poland, there's about 2.5 million, so well over half of the refugees who have crossed are living in Poland. And this means that 10% of the population in Poland is now a Ukrainian refugee, and that the population there has been augmented by 10% overnight. So try to imagine how that might play out in the US if suddenly there was an influx of 10% additional to the population, and the kinds of impacts that that would have on services, on daily life, on the government's ability to cope with all of the demands that that brings. And so UNHCR is very used to working with governments in responding to humanitarian emergencies. And everything that we do is in concert with governments, local authorities, the border police. And so we work as, in a way, a capacity builder. We explain to people who are registering refugees, how do you register refugees and what are the right questions to ask? And we help set up reception centers so that when people arrive at the border and they may be particularly vulnerable or maybe in need of referral for psychosocial counseling, for example, we are there to signpost those services and where they're available. Protection also means, obviously, that people are at risk when they are on the move. And if you can imagine being a refugee, perhaps a mother who has crossed the country in very difficult conditions with young children, arriving at the border, extremely stressed, extremely anxious about the future, distressed about the husband that she may have left behind. And you find yourself at a border crossing and someone approaches you and offers you transport somewhere and says, if you pay the equivalent of $5, I will take you somewhere safe. I'm sure that you can see that, as much as in all of these situations, an extraordinary number of people have been generous in opening their homes and offering transport and food and looking after refugees. Unfortunately, in these situations, there are sometimes malicious actors. And so our job is to really make sure that refugees are aware of those dangers. And so, for example, having signs at the border and having trained staff there who are explaining to refugees, don't ever pay for a service. You should never have to pay for transport. You should not ever hand over your documents to someone. That type of basic advice. And it's very, very important because now a lot happens on social media that any scams or criminal type of activity or misinformation that's out there on the platforms be countered. And so we're sort of running a kind of counter misinformation effort also to make sure that refugees are aware of their rights. And if we hear of any problems that have been happening or people being told the wrong information, we are out there with local organizations fighting that and making sure that people are aware of their rights, of what they're entitled to, and to the best extent that we can, protect these vulnerable refugees and make sure that they are looked after. So one of the final things I want to mention on the response is this is a crisis where cash assistance has been really critical for us to be able to, by partnering with technology companies, banking platforms, and we've seen really an unprecedented response from the private sector, from businesses who have wanted to help intervene in the crisis. And so we have been working with them, for example, to deliver cash assistance payments to refugee families so that those families can have the dignity of having their own funds, and whichever community they end up living in, they can go to the local shop and buy items that are appropriate for themselves and their families. And it also helps support the local economy that they're moving into. So that cash assistance is something now we're assisting about 500,000 refugees are now signed up into our cash assistance program. And in total, in the first 100 days, we managed to help 1.2 million refugees with either information, protection, supplies, cash assistance. So we are now, reaching people at scale. And we are going to continue those efforts, because I think our assessment is that this crisis is going to grow over time. And I'm very sad to say that, but I think particularly with the arrival of winter, which will be extremely challenging, because if you think about the climate in that part of the world, at the moment, it's summer, and if someone has a damaged home, for example, they can get a shelter kit from us with, tarpaulin and basic repair supplies, and they can sort of repair their home and still sort of live there in a relatively safe way. But once the cold weather arrives, you have to winterize, damaged properties, or you have to move refugees into appropriate housing. And so I was talking today with someone who is volunteering with an NGO in Poland. And they, for example, they have a reception center for 700 refugees in Poland. And it's an old Soviet kind of assembly hall. And they've fitted it with, cots and sanitation. And it's been a great reception center for refugees, but it's not winterized. And so it does not have, central heating facilities. The windows are in very poor condition. And they are now trying to raise $2 million to be able to winterize and modify this very large building to make it appropriate for winter. And that's the type of advanced planning that needs to happen in these humanitarian emergencies, because the scale of the housing that's going to be needed to accommodate refugees, both short-term as they cross the border, but also in the more sort of medium to long-term as they, need housing. And there's also obviously school places and healthcare, and the host countries, particularly Poland, who have taken on the responsibility of looking after refugees. They really need the support of the international community in doing that, because the resources that are required to look after refugees, provide public services, provide housing are enormous. And while many European countries have resettled some refugees, so Germany, for example, has received, hundreds of thousands of refugees. And here in the UK, I think there have been so far about 80,000 refugees who've managed to get the visas to arrive and sort of be resettled here. When you're talking about 5 million people who are across the border and 8 million internally displaced in Ukraine, you can see that there's still a greater need for countries to be more generous in how they're resettling refugees. So just finally, before we move to questions, because I know I've been talking for a long time, sort of where are we going from here? I think that one of the challenges is that there are many other refugee crises around the world that need our attention. And obviously, the situation in Ukraine has been very shocking. And I think here in the UK, certainly, it has felt very close to home for many, many British people. And I think one of the reasons that we saw an unprecedented response from businesses in the private sector is that many people here have Ukrainian employees or Ukrainian offices. And there was a desire on the part of the business community to engage in supporting the response on a really large scale. And I think we're also living in an age where consumers and the younger generation is expecting business to be socially responsible and to be engaged in the world. And this is a really positive thing. And I know I'm painting quite a dire picture of the world that we're living in, but there are some positives. And I think seeing the scale of the response from the business community, and that in some cases, businesses have even stepped up to a larger extent than governments have, it's been really exceptional to see that. And I think we're living in a time where it's a really encouraging sign of how private sector partners can play a role not only in financially supporting, but in developing solutions for humanitarian contexts. I was just reading the other day about how Uber has been working with a World Food Program in Poland and in Ukraine to enable drivers to help deliver relief supplies. And so Uber drivers are now engaged in delivering food and delivering supplies. And one of the reasons for wanting Uber drivers is they're driving like regular cars. And that means a humanitarian convoy, big trucks, visible for satellites, potentially a military target for a malicious actor. But when it's just regular cars that are ferrying around, that's actually more secure. And there's been a lot of success in getting humanitarian supplies, delivered that way. And again, I think it's just an example of kind of new ways of thinking and new ways of working around, in humanitarian emergencies. I think from the UNHCR point of view, we would like to see that kind of innovation and that kind of resource mobilization for other refugee crises, because there are many parts of the world where refugees are in need of support. And that's one of the challenges going from here, is making sure that there are resources for other refugee crises as well. I think the advent of winter, as I said earlier, is something that will profoundly change the sort of the humanitarian context and the challenge of the environment that we will be working in the coming months. It will also change things in military terms, and it could have implications for how the conflict itself plays out. And I'm sure some of you, are thinking about that. So I think I'll leave it there. I've spoken at you for quite some time, and I would really welcome any comments or questions.
Okay, thank you. As I said before, we're going to use this raise hand function for people to ask questions. To unmute, can you unmute yourself? There you go. Go ahead.
Hi. Yes, sorry, it just took a little bit to unmute this thing. So Emma, that was quite fascinating. I guess coming from a European perspective, for the fact that, right, Germany and everyone now says, we're not going to buy any more Russian oil and gas. The inflation rate is up 8%. There is going to be massive pain all over Europe in relation to heating crisis and general spending. How do you foresee this affecting the refugee situation if the people don't have enough money to spend on themselves, or such as what all the news media are saying, that is going to be a painful winter in Europe? Obviously, for what you say, these big buildings with no housing, but even for general Europeans.
Very good question. And just to say at the outset that we are a humanitarian agency, and it, we don't generally sort of venture into the political realm that much, because we need to preserve our neutrality and really focus on, protecting and helping refugees. That being said, obviously, I'm happy to sort of offer maybe a bit more of a personal opinion. I mean, Catherine, as you know, we in the UK, it is a very challenging environment politically for refugees, and the government here has recently passed something called the Nationality and Borders Bill, which is a piece of legislation that effectively criminalizes the act of asylum seeking. So refugees, potential refugees who arrive here, for example, on a boat, crossing the channel, putting their life at risk to do that, or arriving by some other means, and who seek to claim asylum based on being persecuted or at risk in their home country, can be criminalized for doing that. And some of you may also have heard that the government has, the UK government has made a deal with the government of Rwanda to take asylum seekers from the UK and house them in Rwanda and take them through the asylum seeking process in Rwanda. And this has been enormously controversial and is being challenged in the courts here in the UK as we speak. And in fact, there was an initial challenge on Friday, and there's going to be an appeal on Monday. The first flight to Rwanda with asylum seekers is supposed to depart the UK on Tuesday. So we are in the thick of a very contentious time, and UNHCR has been very clear that the criminalization of asylum seeking and the externalization of asylum process and claims to Rwanda is in contravention of the UN Convention on Refugees and does not meet the standards that the UK government should be upholding in regard to refugees. I think with the question of the narrative around refugees and how do you mobilize a society that is already in economic distress to support refugees? I think we have to see it as there are a lot of 85% of refugees globally are accommodated or looked after in host countries that we would define as developing nations. So for example, Turkey is the largest host country for refugees in the world. Uganda is one of the largest. I just returned from being in Lebanon, which is a country in economic freefall. There's a population of 6 million in Lebanon, and 1.5 million of the population are Syrian refugees. Again, 25% of the population being a refugee. So I think other countries are already taking on quite a considerable share of the burden, and I think we should see also that refugees make a very positive contribution to the countries that they're living in. And one of the, I think the opportunities in the UK is that there's a shortage of workers here in so many sectors, and a lot of businesses, the NHS is struggling. And I know in the US as well, there are sort of shortages of workers in hospitality, for example. So refugees represent a pool of very motivated workers. And so what can we do with that? And UNHCR is working with a number of businesses here in the UK and some other markets to facilitate refugees working and supporting them in that, and working with businesses to make that successful. And I think a lot more could happen in that space, because in many developed countries, advanced economies are experiencing at the moment population changes, aging population, worker shortages. And so actually we should see refugees as something that makes a positive contribution to the economy. So I think that's part of how you kind of square the circle that you mentioned.
Scott, go ahead. There you go.
Emma, thanks for that explanation. Just to amplify a little bit on the question that Catherine asked, two big concerns, of course, are energy and the loss of, or the impact of the loss of Russian energy sources on Europe, and the other one being the impact on world food supplies, particularly with Ukraine, with their grain being embargoed, or with the Russians preventing them from shipping from their ports. I'm wondering what your thoughts are as far as when we get to, if this conflict continues through the end of the year, do you think that the world will be capable of substituting for the lost food supplies, or what impact that's going to have in the medium term? As well as, do you think that Europe is going to have the capability of weaning itself off of Russian energy by the end of the year?
Sorry, it's not my area of expertise. I think that on the food supply side, the pressures on Russia are growing, including from countries that have so far been relatively neutral in the conflict. So China, for example, which gets a lot of corn from historically anyway, from Russia and Ukraine. India is also a food insecure country, and I think there have been direct appeals by some African countries to Putin about opening up the ports so that grain can be exported. And then of course there's the question of replanting and being able to generate additional harvests. I think that we're getting a bit closer to a possible solution of escorted ships through the Black Sea, with Turkey acting as the escort military escort navy that would be responsible and is seen as kind of a relatively neutral player. So I think there are a lot of efforts going on to try to solve the food crisis, because it is going to be, not only is the humanitarian impact massive, but the impact on the global economy, which countries like China are not going to tolerate. And that's, I think, just the ray of hope, I suppose, that eventually, hopefully sooner rather than later, there will be a solution, at least, on the food supply side. I think on the energy side, I'm just going to say that it's totally outside my sort of area of knowledge. So I'm not sure I can say anything that useful that you haven't already read.
Thank you.
Tom, did I see you? Okay, so I'm going to send you you should be able to unmute yourself. Ed.
Oh, okay, good. Well, Emma, thanks for bringing this forum to our attention, and your presentation is really clear. Yeah, I may have missed your comments, but I don't know if there's any effort in the U.S. to put some pressure on the Biden administration to add that to his list of items of ways of helping Ukraine. Maybe it's already ongoing, I don't know, but if you could enlarge a little bit about what is this country doing politically to support the issues that you raised today.
So again, I haven't lived in the US now for more than 10 years, and I'm not that close to what is happening politically in the UK, in the US, because I'm really following more what's happening in the UK. I do think that the Biden administration has been, and Congress has acted very decisively in the sanctions on Russia, and certainly there's been a lot of support for the Ukrainian government. But I think, as ever with these crises, over time, that will to provide humanitarian assistance, to continue to really prioritize can fade, and also public attention can fade. And I would just ask all of you, and obviously by joining today, I know that you do have a commitment to this cause and this crisis. And I think our challenge in the coming months is going to be to sustain that pressure for the US and the UK and other governments to support the humanitarian effort, in addition to, the diplomatic, political, military, which is a whole nother side of things. It's sort of hard to really express how enormous this is, and that, we could be on the brink of another world war, depending on where things go. And so, our job at UNHCR is just on the humanitarian side. It's looking after refugees and making sure that they are protected in the best way possible. But it is, enormously challenging for a government to, I suppose, respond to this crisis and in all of its complexity. And as voters, the best that you can do is, through your channels, through your member of Congress, through, any other way that you have of speaking out, of influencing, of highlighting that Ukraine, needs support.
Here's a follow-up question. How's the Prime Minister Johnson dealing with it in the UK in terms of the humanitarian effort? Because there's a relationship between what Johnson is doing and what Biden is doing.
Well, it's a very interesting question. So I was at an event earlier today, a sort of public festival event, and there was a panel on Ukraine, and we did a sort of straw poll of the audience. And it was a relatively well-informed, sort of politically engaged type of audience. And we asked people, what's your opinion of the way that the UK has responded to Ukraine? First of all, on the sort of military diplomatic side. Second of all, on the sanctions. And third, on the refugee crisis, thinking specifically about refugees, Ukrainian refugees coming to the UK. And there was a lot of support in the first bucket, for a feeling that the UK had played a leading and constructive role in supporting the government of Ukraine, in really getting also other, getting European governments on board as well, and united behind the sanctions regime, which wasn't easy because Europe is very dependent on Russian oil and gas, as you know. So in general, I think the public here sees, and in fact, there's a publication here called Private Eye, which is a sort of satirical political magazine. And in the first month, there was they always have a cartoon on their front cover. And the cartoon showed Zelensky and Boris Johnson shaking hands, and each saying to the other, "Thank you so much for helping me." And of course, the illusion being that it's helpful to Boris Johnson in a time of him having political problems, that, the war has been a way of sort of shifting public opinion more favorably to him and his leadership. And I think that's a very sort of apt, way of describing what has played out. But on the refugee side, and the government, offered a very generous, potentially generous scheme for Ukrainians to come to the UK with 3-year visas, including the right to work. And also a Homes for Ukraine scheme was opened, and tens of thousands of British people signed up to offer a place to stay to refugees. But the scheme got off to a very, very slow start. And there were all sorts of problems with, they were asking Ukrainians to submit biometric data for babies. And one part of the Home Office was handling the under 18 visas, and then another part, the adult visas. So you would have the the parents had a visa, but the children didn't, and it was taking forever. And it just was extremely sort of, I think, it was managed in a way that many people felt was very bureaucratic and not flexible. So that part of the response for the UK, I think, has really not been very favorably seen by the public. So, and actually, I'd be curious whether in the US there's a more favorable view of the way that Ukrainian refugees have been welcomed, and what that process has been for them to enter in the US, whether it's been more streamlined and happened more efficiently. And we're finally now, 3.5 months in, getting to the point where a number of Ukrainians are now arriving here, but it's taken a long time. Any other questions?
Yeah, we have somebody at Chio's house. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Gerald. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my name is Gerald Dankner. And of course, the work the UNHCR does is absolutely wonderful. I have a kind of I hope it's not an inappropriate question, but whenever I donate to any organization, I always ask them, what percentage of my donation goes to your good work and what percentage goes to the administration of the donations? The administration of the effort.
Right. So in an emergency like this, we launch appeals for, we launched an appeal for Afghanistan last summer, for example, and so obviously now funds that are coming in for Ukraine are being directed to Ukraine, and I'd have to check with my American colleague, because I'm a bit more familiar with the statistics for here in the UK. But I think UNHCR generally, a very low percentage of our budget is spent on fundraising costs and administrative costs. The vast majority, we have a staff of 18,000 around the world, and the vast majority of them are field-based, local hires. So, Ukrainians working in Ukraine, people that we hire in the country to carry out the work. We do have, specialized staff who work for UNHCR, centrally, who are legal experts and kind of technical experts. But in fact, again, going back to the point about us being capacity builders, we tend to have small country offices with sort of a small number of sort of UNHCR kind of global staff, and then a much larger cohort of local Afghans or local Sudanese who would be actually, running the refugee programs, the refugee camps. And in Ukraine, in an emergency situation, we've been massively scaling up our presence and our staff cohort in order to be able to, respond to this emergency at scale. But maybe could I perhaps come back to you with a more exact response?
That's fine. I mean, it was just.
I could volunteer something to that too, if you don't mind me interrupting. One of the reasons we chose UNHCR in the first place was because, not apart from knowing you, is that it's when you go to Charity Navigator, which is the main source that I typically use, it gets 4 or 5 stars, something like that, one of the very highest levels based on effectiveness and utility or utilization of the, gross equals net in terms of how much of the money actually flows through to the relief effort. So it's one of the highest ranked organizations. I can sorry for the interruption.
Oh no, that's okay. And that's I guess that's the reason that I brought that up, because I think that's a good talking point.
Thank you.
This might be a good point for me to share this information for anybody who does want to donate. This gives you the URL to go to, and over on the right, upper right, you can change the country to whatever country you're in, and it'll bring up the agency for that country that you can give your money to. I believe that's right, Emma?
No, that's right. And just to explain that UNHCR, well, in a similar way to UNICEF also operates this way. Quite a large portion of our budget comes from private donations. So UNHCR obviously has government funders, and actually the US is by far the largest government funder to UNHCR, but the private donations have represented an increasing number. And in an emergency in particular, it was really astonishing in this context and last summer with Afghanistan that the people who stepped up first are the donors like you, literally on, overnight, the donations just started flooding in, and governments move much more slowly. So of the initial 500 million that UNHCR raised towards the Ukraine and neighboring country response for the Ukraine crisis, I think about 2/3 of that 500 million came from private donations, because people responded so quickly and companies and partners responded so quickly. Governments were a little bit slower on the uptake. Anyone else?
Don't see any more raised hands. Somebody's walking over.
That's me. Just to, if they're
there's Bill. Okay, Bill. Go ahead, Bill McNeely.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes.
Hello?
We don't,
okay,
yes,
very good.
Yeah, we don't see you though.
If you insist, there
there
I am.
Hi, Bill.
Okay. Hi. Judy, thank you for doing such a great job moderating. And Emma, thank you for staying up late and talking to us here on the other side of the ocean. This is probably not your idea of a fun Saturday night date. That being said, one of the things I'm curious about in these refugee situations in particular, communication is just critical. And one of the things I've wondered is, do the Poles speak Ukrainian? Do Ukrainians speak Polish? Does everyone speak Russian? And does anybody speak any variety of English, which, as you know, is sort of the lingua franca these days, or maybe we should say the lingua Anglia or something, I don't know. Anyway, that's my question.
It's a super question. And so Polish and Ukrainian are quite different languages, actually. And while certainly the older generation in Ukraine would speak Russian, and the older generation in Poland would also speak Russian, there will be a whole kind of younger generation that doesn't. So I think Google Translate will have come in incredibly useful. And in fact, I was hearing from a friend who's taken in a Ukrainian refugee here in the UK who doesn't speak a word of English. And literally they've just been using Google Translate to communicate. And thank goodness, we live in a world now where technology again comes to our rescue in enabling that communication. So I think many of my colleagues who work in these in the field are very adept and speak multiple languages, but that's also the reason why hiring people who are local and who can speak those local languages and be able to communicate with refugees is incredibly important. We've also found in all of the information that we've shared, so the websites, the helplines, the chat bots that we've set up so that refugees can come online and ask, it's like a frequently asked questions, and so that we can get that information out to them, communicating on platforms like Viber and Telegraph, which are very commonly used in that part of the world. We all know about Facebook and WhatsApp, and having that facility to do in Ukrainian, so that Ukrainian refugees can be aware of their rights, signposted to services, and have the fact that they have mobile phones and that we can take that information if they're willing to share it when they register at the border, it enables us to communicate with them proactively. But you're right, language remains a challenge, and I don't think that English is that commonly spoken.
Catherine has another question.
Okay, this is actually, I am trying not to get Bill in trouble, but this is actually a response to Bill's question of who speaks what. So I have a relative who lives somewhere in Europe, whose country shall be unnamed, who is in the special forces, took some holidays and went to fight in Ukraine. He definitely does not speak Ukrainian, and nor does he speak English. And the people there don't speak whatever he's speaking, but he made it back, and somehow, I guess if you have a way, you manage.
Wow. That's an amazing story, actually.
Yeah.
I'm glad he's safe.
He's safe, yes.
Don't see any more raised hands. Now is your chance, last chance.
All right, well, perhaps this would be a good point to wrap up. Thank you, Judy, for moderating. Thank you, Emma, for, as my colleague Bill McNeely said, staying up until 10 o'clock your time on Saturday. And thanks to all of our friends from overseas, as well as domestically. Brown Club will be sending you out a survey just for your thoughts on this, and also to do a tally of how much we have raised overall for this. And I'll be sharing those results with all of you. So you'll see that coming soon. Please, if you enjoyed this event, feel free to visit our website at browncluboc.org. You can subscribe if you like and stay updated on events that we have in future. And thanks again, everyone, for your participation and support of this event. I feel a little more hopeful knowing that there's so many people out there that are coming together for this important thing and who care. So have a good evening to you all.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for supporting the cause.